A black CEO goes undercover as a job applicant to expose hidden bias in his own company. What he uncovers will leave you questioning everything about workplace fairness. The clock on the wall ticked faintly, marking 9 o'clock a.m. sharp. In the waiting area of Bright Edge Corporation's headquarters in Seattle, a man in his mid-40s adjusted his tie. His name was Malcolm Ross, well-dressed, poised, and carrying a portfolio that seemed to hold decades of experience. Yet, his calm exterior betrayed none of the thoughts running through his mind. Malcolm wasn't just another job seeker. What no one in the office knew was that he was the CEO of Bright Edge, incognito, on a mission to assess his company's hiring practices. After hearing whispers of discrimination in the recruitment process, Malcolm decided to see for himself. Today's interview would be different, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The door to the interview room opened. A woman in a crisp grey suit stood there, clipboard in hand. Her nameplate read, Ms. Richardson, hiring manager. With a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she gestured for Malcolm to enter. Mr. Ross, correct? She asked, extending her hand briefly before retreating to her seat. Her tone was polite but clipped, as though she'd already made up her mind. Malcolm responded with a warm, yes, thank you for having me. He sat across from her, placing his portfolio neatly on the table. The conversation began smoothly. Questions about his resume, his previous leadership roles, and his experience managing high-profile projects. Malcolm answered with measured confidence, laying out examples of his work in revitalizing struggling companies. Yet as he spoke, he noticed something. Ms. Richardson's eyes flickered with skepticism, and her responses became increasingly curt. By the time they reached the technical portion of the interview, the atmosphere had grown tense. Ms. Richardson's tone shifted, her words edged with passive-aggressive remarks disguised as casual banter. Impressive. But I have to wonder if this level of leadership might be a bit ambitious for someone with your background, she said, her smile thin and insincere. Malcolm paused, choosing his words carefully. I believe strong leadership comes from diverse experiences and the ability to adapt, qualities I've demonstrated consistently over my career. She nodded, scribbling something on her clipboard. But her next question veered off course. Do you think you'd be able to fit into our culture here? It's unique. We're a fast-paced, competitive team, and our clients have very high standards. Malcolm understood the undertone. He smiled politely but felt the subtle sting of the implication. Still, he didn't let it show, but what she said next would leave a mark. Ms. Richardson leaned back in her chair, twirling a pen between her fingers. Her tone was cool, casual, too casual. You've certainly had an interesting career path, she said, her words slow and deliberate. But I'm not sure if it aligns with the direction we're heading as a company. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, as though seeking clarification. I'd be happy to hear more about what you mean. My goal is to bring value to the team, no matter the environment. She chuckled lightly, the sound hollow. It's not about value, really. It's about synergy. Sometimes even the most qualified candidates don't quite fit the vision we have. Her words hung in the air, and Malcolm could feel their weight. He could see it in her eyes, the subtle bias she tried so hard to cloak behind professionalism. It wasn't about his qualifications. It wasn't about his vision. It was about him, and she was making it abundantly clear. She closed the folder containing his resume and smiled, a tight, dismissive gesture. Thank you for coming in, Mr. Ross. We'll be in touch if we decide to move forward. There it was, the kind of rejection that didn't need further explanation. But Malcolm didn't stand up right away. Instead, he took a deep breath and leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers. I appreciate your time, Miss Richardson, he said, his voice steady. I'm curious, though. If qualifications and vision aren't what you're looking for, what is? For a brief moment, her mask slipped. The smile faltered, and her eyes darted away before she quickly regained her composure. As I said, it's about synergy, she repeated, her tone sharper this time. We're looking for someone who fits the mold. Malcolm nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I see. Thank you for clarifying. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and extended his hand. She hesitated before shaking it, her grip limp. As he turned to leave, he glanced back briefly. It's always insightful to see how companies define their mold. With that, he walked out, his steps measured, his mind already racing. But what Ms. Richardson didn't realize was that this interview was far from over. Malcolm walked down the hallway, passing rows of polished glass offices and bustling employees. His face betrayed no emotion, but inside, he was calculating his next move. The sting of Ms. Richardson's thinly veiled bias was fresh, but it wasn't unexpected. It was, after all, the very reason he was here today. Instead of heading to the exit, Malcolm took a sharp turn toward the elevator. The sleek silver doors reflected his composed expression as he pressed the button for the top floor. As the elevator ascended, he adjusted his tie once more, the faintest hint of a smirk appearing on his face. The doors opened to the executive suite, a floor adorned with modern decor, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an unmistakable air of authority. Malcolm's assistant, a sharp-eyed young man named Anthony, greeted him immediately. "Mr. Ross," Anthony said with a knowing glance, "the team is ready for you in the boardroom." Malcolm nodded. "Good. Let's not keep them waiting." He strode into the boardroom, where the company's senior leadership sat in anticipation. They rose when he entered, their demeanor shifting to one of respect and formality. Malcolm took his seat at the head of the table, placing his portfolio in front of him. "Before we begin today's agenda," Malcolm started, his voice calm but firm, "I want to share an experience I just had in one of our hiring processes." The room fell silent. The executives exchanged curious glances, unsure of where this was going. "I just came from an interview with one of our hiring managers," he continued. "Ms. Richardson." A murmur rippled through the room. Malcolm raised a hand, silencing them. It was enlightening, to say the least. I posed as a candidate, bringing my qualifications and experience to the table, and despite exceeding the requirements for the role, I was dismissed, not for my abilities, but for reasons that had nothing to do with the job. The air in the room grew heavy as the implications of his words sank in. Some of the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I've heard whispers of bias in our hiring practices," Malcolm said, his tone now sharper. "But whispers aren't enough. I needed to see it firsthand, and now I have." Anthony stepped forward, handing out copies of Malcolm's notes on the interview. The room was still as each executive began to read. "What's even more troubling," Malcolm continued, "is that this isn't just a reflection of Ms. Richardson's judgment. It's a reflection of the culture we've allowed to persist within this company." His words hung in the air like a weight no one could escape. But this confrontation wasn't over. Malcolm had one more move to make. The boardroom was silent, save for the sound of papers rustling as the executives read through Malcolm's detailed account of the interview. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between the pages and Malcolm's unyielding expression. Others wore faces of quiet disbelief, as though struggling to reconcile the allegations with the company they thought they knew. Finally, the chief operating officer, a man in his early 50s named Howard Green, broke the silence. "Malcolm, are you certain this was about bias? Ms. Richardson has been with the company for over a decade. She's one of our most seasoned managers." Malcolm's gaze was steady. "Howard, I've built my career on reading between the lines." Her words were calculated, her tone dismissive, and her reasoning vague. "And let's not pretend this is an isolated incident. We've all seen the patterns. Who gets promoted, who gets hired, and who gets overlooked." Howard opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by Malcolm's raised hand. "This isn't up for debate. This is a wake-up call, and I'm not here to vilify one person. I'm here to fix what's broken." At that moment, the boardroom doors opened, and Ms. Richardson stepped in, her face a mix of confusion and unease. She had been summoned, but didn't know why. Her eyes widened slightly as she saw Malcolm seated at the head of the table, his presence now unmistakably authoritative. "Ms. Richardson," Malcolm began, his voice calm but firm. "Please, take a seat." She hesitated, glancing around the room before complying. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone cautious. "You tell me," Malcolm replied. This morning, I interviewed with you as a prospective candidate. Do you remember? Her face froze for a split second before she forced a polite smile. Of course, Mr. Ross, wasn't it? That's correct, Malcolm said. But what you didn't realize is that I'm also Malcolm Ross, the CEO of this company. Her expression faltered, and the room seemed to shrink around her. She opened her mouth to speak, but Malcolm continued before she could find her words. I want you to explain to this room why you dismissed me as a candidate, he said, his tone even but commanding. Let's start with your comment about synergy. What exactly did you mean by that? Ms. Richardson's eyes darted to Howard, searching for support, but his expression was unreadable. I was referring to the team dynamic, she stammered. I didn't think you would fit. And what led you to that conclusion? Malcolm pressed. Because my qualifications were above and beyond what the role required. Or was it something else? The tension in the room was palpable. Ms. Richardson's voice wavered as she attempted to respond. I never intended to discriminate, Malcolm interjected, his voice sharper now. Intention doesn't matter. What matters is the impact. And the impact of your decisions ripples far beyond one interview. Ms. Richardson looked down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of her actions, and the scrutiny of the room, was too much to bear. But Malcolm wasn't done. He had one final point to drive home. Malcolm let the silence linger, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone in the room. Ms. Richardson's knuckles whitened as she gripped her hands together, her gaze fixed on the polished surface of the table. This isn't just about you, Ms. Richardson, Malcolm said, his tone softer now, though no less resolute. It's about a system we've allowed to fester, a system where talent is overlooked because of bias, conscious or otherwise. And the truth is, you're not the only one responsible. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each executive. We are all responsible. Every time we ignored a concern, every time we prioritized comfort over fairness, we became complicit. That ends today. Howard cleared his throat, his voice tentative. Malcolm, what do you propose we do? I've already started, Malcolm replied. He gestured to Anthony, who handed out another set of documents. This is a plan to overhaul our hiring and promotion processes. It includes mandatory bias training, third-party oversight of recruitment, and a commitment to transparency in how we evaluate candidates. The executives murmured amongst themselves, scanning the documents. Ms. Richardson remained silent, her face pale. But it doesn't stop there, Malcolm continued. We need to create a culture where everyone, regardless of their background, feels valued and has the opportunity to succeed. That means holding ourselves accountable at every level. The room fell silent again, as his words sank in. Then Malcolm turned to Ms. Richardson. You have two options, he said. You can choose to step down, or you can stay and be part of the solution. But if you stay, it won't be easy. You'll need to confront your own biases, learn from this experience, and work to rebuild trust, not just with me, but with every person who walks through our doors. Ms. Richardson swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. I'd like to stay and make it right. Malcolm nodded, his expression unreadable. Then prove it. Actions speak louder than words. But Malcolm wasn't finished. There was one final step to take, one that would ensure this moment wasn't just a fleeting change. Malcolm rose from his chair and walked toward the large windows that overlooked the city skyline. The room remained silent, every eye on him as they waited for his next words. Turning back, he faced the group with a firm, resolute expression. This isn't just about what happens within these walls, he began. It's about the message we send to the world. Bright Edge is a leader in this industry, and with that comes responsibility. If we want to claim that title, we must reflect those values in everything we do. He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. I'm instituting immediate changes. Starting next week, we'll launch an initiative to track and address equity in hiring and advancement. We'll also create an anonymous feedback system for employees to report discrimination or bias without fear of retaliation. And this will be shared publicly, with clear accountability metrics. Howard nodded slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. "You're right," he said. "This is long overdue." Malcolm's gaze swept the room. "I expect every leader here to fully commit to these changes. And if you're not ready to do that, let me know now, and we'll part ways." The room was silent, but there was a shift in the air. Less resistance, more acceptance. The executives exchanged glances, and one by one they nodded their agreement. Even Ms. Richardson, her voice shaking slightly, said, "I'm ready to make this right." Malcolm returned to his seat. "Good, because this isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about building something better. Not for us, but for the people who depend on us to lead by example." The meeting adjourned, but the echoes of Malcolm's words lingered. As the executives filed out, some deep in thought, others resolute, Malcolm remained seated, watching the city below. Later that week, a company-wide email was sent out, detailing the new initiatives and the leadership's commitment to change. Employees were cautiously optimistic, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope that things might truly improve. As for Ms. Richardson, she kept her promise. She attended the bias training sessions, met with employees to hear their concerns, and worked tirelessly to regain their trust. It wasn't an easy road, but she understood that redemption isn't given, it's earned. Malcolm's actions sent ripples far beyond Bright Edge's walls. Competitors began re-evaluating their own practices, and articles praised the company's transparency and commitment to fairness. It was a start. Not perfect, but meaningful. The lesson here is simple but profound. Change begins with accountability. It takes courage to confront uncomfortable truths, but without that courage, progress is impossible. Malcolm didn't just expose bias. He used it as a catalyst for transformation, proving that leadership isn't about power, it's about responsibility. And if you believe in creating a world where fairness and opportunity are available to everyone, take a moment to reflect on your own actions and choices. What role can you play in making a difference? If this story moved you, consider sharing it, subscribing to our channel, and joining us in fostering conversations that matter.